Good evening. Tomorrow night marks the start of NavRatri, one of the most important festivals of the Hindu and I would say Indo-European calendar. With that in mind, here's a brief overview of what we're celebrating and why. Now, NavRatri means 9 nights. Nava, 9, Ratri, night. The goddess in question obviously being Durga, the warrior goddess, amongst many other things. Broadly cognate, we might suggest, to the Greek Athena, amongst many other Indo-European expressions. In the North Indian tradition, we mark each one of the 9 nights as being dedicated to a particular Navadurga aspect of Matadi, whereas in South India, it is more common to regard it as 3 sets of 3 days apiece, one for each of the Tridevi. In either case, Navaratri is followed by a 10th day, Dussehra Vijayadashami, which is symbolically tied to a number of mythic culminations of war against evil. As applies the tradition we follow, in addition to the more commonly commemorated victory of Mother Durga against the demon Mahishasura, the 9 nights also trace a deeper set of stories and cycle, that of the rebirth and resurrection of the goddess as the daughter of the mountain, Shalaputri, the mountain in question being the king of the Himalayas, following her self-immolation upon the pyre of the ill-starred sacrifice of Daksha, and the ongoing pathway of ascension and re-empowerment which she undergoes until eventually re-emanatizing the true status as the all-powerful, a rather figurative, partial rendering of Siddhidatri, now that I think about it, Shakti. It is also, of course, as with many great religious texts, a beautiful love story, in part composed of the goddess's determination to overcome even death itself, although Mrityunjaya is of course appropriately enough a title more commonly affixed to another, in pursuit of reunification with her beloved Mahadeva, and the post-reincarnation tribulations she encounters, particularly as Brahmacharini, the seeker of the Absolute, when endeavouring to win back the heart of the grieving great god, who has become so overwhelmed with the loss of his other half, the theonym Artana Ishvara, helping to show just how sincerely this term is meant. That's literally what Artana Ishvara means, the god who is half woman, in the sense that Shiva's other half is literally Devi. That in addition to carrying out the most appropriately brutal of dismembering sanctions against those responsible, and wandering the universe in search of peace, that he has mythically, literally burnt to ashes Kamadeva, love, a figure not entirely unlike modern Western depictions of Cupid in some elements of form and function, for daring to attempt to intervene. The reunification of the divine pair, which is associated with the culmination of the first 3 nights of Navratri, and in particular the celebrated marriage which takes place following the revelation of Chandraganta, literally moon bell, although more figuratively illumination, leads on to a perhaps more exoterically directed phase of the Navadurgas. Here, just as moon progresses to sun, with a growing intensity of rays and warmth and generative power following the dawn, princess takes on the greater regality of queen, with the aspect of Kushmanda, having the supreme imperial power even over the sun, Surya. This, as a point of interest, records what is very likely the ancient Proto-Indo-European pantheon's setup, wherein, in direct contrast to the Greek-influenced popular perception of such things, it appears that the solar deity was in fact often female, something also attested via Sol in the Nordic cosmology and associated mythography, and perhaps also in Scythian Tabiti, and exercising judicious responsibility for the nourishment of the whole of the creation via the sun's holy rays. For more upon all of that, you should check the Radiant Queen of the Heavens series we've been running earlier this year. What may be regarded as a motherly, generative and matrimonial phase of the Navadurgas is then presented in more literal terms with Skandamata, mother of Skanda, the Hindu war god, well, one of several deities with a strong war function in their portfolio, who takes after his mother in that regard. Although, interestingly, as connoted by the Kartikeya theonym of Skanda, she does not necessarily give birth to him, but that is another story for another time, although it nevertheless occurs that notwithstanding the fact that she is genetically Skanda's mother, the recognition and consequent incorporation of worthy figures directly into the imperial household via adoption of a sort continues the regal emblematic exemplary conduct of this phase of the Navadurgas. The birth of Lord Skanda does not simply represent a greater immanentization of motherhood into the Navadurga cycle, but also introduces a most serious theme of righteous violence. For the ensuing Navadurga forms, Katyayani and Kalratri are counted amongst the foremost warrior forms and slayer-destroyer aspects of the goddess. The former is directly responsible for the slaying of Mahishasura, which we might perhaps regard as something akin to the archetypal Durga demon-slaying myth, and radiant as the beautiful force embodiment of divine anger, the self-empowered blade of vindication through devastation, while the latter is as dark, Kal, as the void which preceded creation, as all-consuming as time, Kal, the fire in which the universe entire burns during the span of existence, of course, and as all-unfolding as night, Ratri, and with all the finality and annihilation of the ultimate destroyer of the universe. These two Navadurga aspects thus represent both the righteous upholding and protection of Dharma through most beautifully incarnated violence, as well as the power and penchant to protect her devotees, Dharmo Rakshatiya Rakshitaha. Kalratri also represents illumination, for in the dark of the night, Kalratri literally, the truth can shine clearer, particularly if, like stars, it is hidden during daylight hours. But if the phase running to Kalratri represents the rising power of anger and the celebration of righteous violence, then the transition from Kalratri to Mahagauri, which literally means the great white, the great whiteness, or the great beauty, is its culmination and transcension. Here, the immense fury of Kalratri, which burns with such black intensity as to exceed the universe itself, is sublimated into a more beatific emotion. And while in some tellings, Mahagauri is the restoration of the fairness and beauty of Devi, following whatever calamitous crisis that Kali was manifested for having passed, generally in tide of blood, rather literally in the case of Shakambari, it would perhaps be more apt to regard the state not as the absence of anger, but rather as the establishment of control over the previous quality of berserk fury, so that it does not burn out of control and become destabilizing in its all-consuming rage. This can be adduced, in part, from some of the specific mythology around Mahagauri, wherein, after having managed to once again regain her most fair complexion from the blackness of the Kali form as Mahagauri, Durga voluntarily readopts the terrifying annihilator aspect as necessary to confront the specific threats arrayed against her. This self-mastery, and its accompanying mastery of the universe at large, also underpins the subsequent and final transformation that from Mahagauri to Siddhidatri. Just as the movement from blackness to white light entails the spectrum from that which is beyond nothingness to everything, for within white light, as can be seen via the aid of a prism, lies the entire run of the colors and qualities of visible light. So too does the final form entail, put simply, all and everything. Here, Siddhidatri is regarded on one level as the bestower of boons, of powers, with the cities in question being regarded as abilities that Mother D has attained, and representing qualities and faculties that can be bestowed upon the worthy and learned devotee. Yet it is interesting to look further at the linguistics at play here, as Siddhi can also mean perfection, fulfillment, wisdom, and liberation. This is thus a most fitting final destination along the Navadurga path. While Datri, in addition to its meaning as bestower or giver, also cognate and from the same English roots as terms like dative and donation, with a slight change of inflection, which I won't pronounce, is rendered as earth, thus conceptually linking back to both Durga as Earth Mother and more figuratively with the symbolic connotation of the span of the universe in mind, in conjunction with Siddhi, referring to the one who makes whole the world. As we often regard those we love, wives in adulthood, our mothers, more especially when we are younger. Although as ever, and as extensively shown via the specific myths of the previous 8 forms, this making whole of the world often entails active violence against those who would poison and destroy its fabric and inhabitants, both mortal and otherwise, as well as, in slightly more modern connotation, the idea of the foster mother. The idea of the perfect foster mother is very much an appropriate one for how we regard her, and stands at the opposite end of the spectrum, and yet not at all distinct from young maid Shalaputri, with whom the Navadurga cycle began. Interestingly, though, it also represents arguably a greater self-realization and empowerment, self-mastery, and universally immanent might, as compared to the previous culmination of the cycle of Devi, as Lady Sati, the wife of Lord Shiva, whose self-immolation, in response to her father's most rash and affronting endeavours at the humiliation of the divine couple, leads to her reincarnation as Shalaputri as a result. I hesitate to say in the first place for other Adi-Shakti related reasons. After all, not only do we see the mistakes of the past successfully overcome, the pattern of the previous cycle abrogated with, for instance, Chandraganta's dispelling of her father's highly unfavourable misperception of Mahadeva, thus allowing for a far better relationship between Shiva and his father-in-law this time around, as compared to the lethally fractious one he had grimacingly borne from Daksha, as father of Sati towards him earlier. But it is hard to further imagine Durga by now the mightiest of the gods, in part as a result of this quest or journey of empowerment, and quite literally universally, that is to say by the universe and its fabric itself, hailed as the power, Shakti, allowing herself to be placed in such a clearly iniquitous position by the petty and small-minded dictates of what is ultimately a lesser being. This with regard to Daksha, the aforementioned. In both cases, there are ardent lessons for the devotee of clear and valuable ambit, or amber, and a universe strewn with titanic corpses of some of those who have refused to get the point, or rather got the point of the spear, I should say. Bringing it back to matters contemporary, I shall endeavour to do as I have done in previous years, and post one of these on each Navadurga aspect upon their night. There's a pandala which goes with the textual form of this article, which I shall link in the comments, which depicts each of the 9 Navadurgas, as well as Lady Sati upon the pyre, as well as the presence of Mahadeva, as is represented by the Tripundra and Triambaka. Alongside can also be seen her sons, Ganesha and Skanda, in addition to the other Tridevi, Lakshmi and Saraswati, as well as, of course, Dawan, the Vahana of Mother Durga. A very fitting beginning indeed. Jai Mata Di. Thank you.